And now I guess we'll open up for questions.
Mr. Martinez, you should be.
How's it going?
Hi, Robert.
Thanks, Ryan. That's amazing. What is your favorite maybe script that you've worked on, and whatever some of these things that you've been talking about, Negative Engine, what's something that you've worked on that you've kind of really been proud of, and kind of show some of these things that you've talked about today?
Well, what's interesting is I think these have come from my own failures as a writer. So, the thing is, because a lot of the studio, a lot of the things I've worked on have been problematic in that, I wrote a sequel to Twins called Triplets, or like there was a lot of things I wrote that were like reboots or things, and that's what makes them hard because they don't naturally come to that. So a lot of what I just said to you was things I learned the hard way myself. And now in my own writing, I'm using it, but they aren't, because the thing is, it's often hard because you don't necessarily think of ideas this way. Your idea might be, I want to do a story about first contact with aliens or whatever, but you're not necessarily saying who's the protagonist. So what I found though now is this is like I keep going back to it throughout my own development of work, whatever. So I learned it the hard way, I guess. But Gorgeous George, I would say Gorgeous George is the one that I really kind of learned it while writing the third draft.
All right, we have a question from Timothy.
Hi there.
Hi, Timothy. Hello.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very, very interesting to me. I'm not a script writer, so I think I learned a lot. My question really has to do with how you would apply these principles to very short films, because that's what's being produced all the time. And occasionally I see, for example, a 30-second advertisement, and I'm just stunned that they can somehow or other tell a story in that period of time or in 60 seconds. When you're doing that, do you really need to be concentrating on all three things, or do you think you should concentrate on
to me, then it's point of view would be shorter things. In the world of advertising, it is all point of view. Who is your audience? What do they want to see? You know what I mean? It's like you wouldn't see, like Mac or Apple wouldn't have ads with like people, the swamp people or whatever. You know what I mean? They want because the advertisement, the point of view is supposed to be who the viewer is targeted for. So you want to kind of put it with, the best ads, I would say, or kind of are put through the eyes of who your ideal audience is. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
And I think each one, in a way, the right moment and the sort of narrative engine for an ad, you can kind of dive in. I don't know the world of marketing all that well, but I'm sure you could look at the different genres of kind of commercials they have, of how do you showcase this project and kind of base it and build it out that way.
Thank you. Thanks.
My pleasure.
All right, do we have any other questions? Oh, okay, we have one from Sebastian.
Brian, thank you so much. That was wonderful.
My pleasure. Thank you, Sebastian.
Yeah, so I'm actually not a screenwriter either. I'm a DP mostly. But I had a question more of how did you said you learned all this from your failures. How were you able to recognize your failures? Was it kind of after the process was done and you're like, oh, I could have done this better? Or was it someone mentoring you, or just general feedback from anybody you sent it to, or all of it?
That's a great question. There was a mix. I mean, what's interesting about working in Hollywood is you rarely get like feedback you would in school, where, you do a scene or something and someone, your teacher's like, well, that didn't work because blah, blah, blah. More often in Hollywood, you just get, okay, they've passed. They decided finally not to do it. And so for me, there was a sense, because I always knew, I've been reading scripts, like what made a good script, but in the writing, I was sort of writing the stuff that by all points of view was well written. Like, you know but it was like, oh, these things kept kind of getting passed. And because some of them were not my own imagination, because they were other people's ideas, which is what you mostly work on in Hollywood, I think I had a sort of, I was able to step away and start thinking, now, why didn't it sort of get made? Or why was it passed? And just sort of looking at it. And one of the things I kept hearing too was, oh, we wanted more about the character. And that's the stuff that I realized what was missing, because when I was younger, I took that as, oh, the character needs more lines, or, oh, the character needs more scenes. And what I didn't realize is it's like, no, the character, it's like and that's where in Gorgeous Storage, it was like a eureka experience of like, no, the scene has to be written from the point of view of your protagonist. And it started there. And then the more I read it, then from that point, reading more scripts and really looking at movies that worked, and why did they work? How were the ideas set up? How was the plot set up? And this, these kind of 3 rules came from, 10 years, 15 years of both sort of having successes, having failures, and really self-analyzing, my own work and other people's work. And I think that's important, is to be able to really, as much as you can, it's always difficult to do it fully, but to be able to kind of have that 10,000 view of your own work. And to me, the 3 talking points I just said, what's great about those is you can't really cheat around them. You know what I mean? You can't sort of like, well, mine's kind of like it. I can, even when I'm developing stuff, I know this doesn't quite have a narrative engine yet. The narrative engine one I find is often if I have trouble writing a log line. To me, the best, if your script works, you should be able to pretty much easily do a log line in a sentence or 2. Because what I've seen in my experience is like, I write this project and people are like, so what is it about? I'm like, well, it's this and this and this and this. That to me now is like the red flag of, oh, I haven't actually figured out these 3 things. There's another hand I see in the second row.
Michaela.
Hi, Michaela.
Hi. I just had a quick question. So I'm in screenwriting class right now. I've been hearing a lot about, you should include this in a screenplay. You should have these elements. You should have these kinds of arcs. And I was curious what you thought should absolutely not ever be in a screenplay. Not something that should be included, but something that should never be included.
It's a great question. I tend to think of it is I'm a big fan of knowing the rules and then breaking them. And, to me, I think one of the examples is people say, hey, show, don't tell, or hey, don't try to direct it. And when I was younger, again, and I wasn't as good of a writer, I really held by that religiously, trying to have as much white space as possible, what have you. But there was a movie that was made, an indie movie of one of my scripts. What I realized from that is I had written a sort of very open script, but it ended up the director completely directed it the complete opposite way that I wrote it. I wrote something that was supposed to be super fast paced, so I wrote more dialogue heavy. So because thinking it was going to be fast and they're moving around, and he ended up directing it as very slow and sincere. And I took a 90-page script in night 5, and the assembly cut was like 2 hours and 45 minutes. And you sort of had to cut it down. And it became sort of vacuous. So, I don't think there's any, something like photos I wouldn't do. It's more about how you do things. Someone like a Charlie Kaufman can get away with stuff because he's such an expert at the form. And to me, it's more about like learning how to do it the right way. And then, if you want to experiment, if you want to add more of a kind of direction or things like that, or more of like actor, how their face looks, whatever. But it's really about learning the form first and then having fun with that's because you learn the form, and then your voice is what comes after it. You know what I mean? It's like your voice is how you work within the form. And I think there's a lot of people who will be like, screenplay structure, it's so suffocating, why it's all the same. It's like, no, we've had the same screenplay structure since the ancient Greeks, and no matter how avant-garde something is, you can look at Waiting for Godot, everything like usually the big event happens at the midpoint, so the rules have always been there. You can see it in, from things 1,000 years ago, but it's how you use them and so I think a lot of people confuse like wanting to do something crazy with not really understanding how storytelling works. Is there something, I was curious to you, is there something in your class they say never do?
I've never been told like specifically don't include this thing. I mean, I think there's a couple people who have like really picky, like I don't ever want to see this specific moment in your film. And that's just kind of, but I was referring to how there's so many things, especially in regards to story. There's so many different ways that you can go about crafting your story and following these narrative arcs and all of these moments that like a writer's journey type thing, where all of these characters follow the specific thing that everybody goes through, and you almost can't get away from it because that's what works so well. And I was just wondering if there was something that you had found worked really well to stay away from in regards to that so consistent narrative arc and character development.
Well, I think it has to do with execution more than it is, because you can find it online. There's this amazing chart that has the structure breakdown of all the big, the Sid Field, all of the different, the Save the Cat, all those you can see, and it's all basically the same. It's the same with the Greeks. It's so much about, to me, it's people rely on that. It is execution. It's what you do within it. For example, I'm working on a script, writing it with a big producer now, and what's fun about working with her is she's seen all these movies. She's produced movies, so there's an element of when we're showing pages or whether she's like, I've seen this, and it kind of, that's what I would say is, the differences of knowing what is sort of cliche or like what you're doing, and like, oh, there's been 100 different horror movies that have done the red balloon or a red ball, rolling down the hall, which is something because your mind, you can't help but you're digesting horror movies, for example. You're like, oh, and what's scary? And so you're kind of connecting to what you've seen before. So I think that's the hard job of the screenwriter is it's not only knowing the structure, but like, what else can you do except the red ball, rolling down the hall? Whatever the child stuff, like what is another version that we haven't seen and that's surprising?
All right, we have time for one more question, and the countdown will start for the film at the 45 after the hour, just to let you know. But Rodney, I am going to spotlight you for your question. Here you are.
Hi, Rodney.
Hi, nice to meet you, Ryan.
You.
I really admire your three basic points. Like with the logline, I think that you've really got it when it's simplest and easiest to explain. I'm wondering if you have any such simple points for dialogue writing.
I've learned this the hard way too. When you're in, I was lucky. One of my short films that I did, the person who was a friend who's the editor now edits the Avengers movies. And it was amazing as I wrote this thing, and I was always complimented on my dialogue and from the actors and everything. What I was amazed is once you're in that cutting room and you're with someone who really knows what they do, basically, 40% of the dialogue you write won't be in the final cut. And so I think it's keeping it moving, keeping it tight. And remember, because this is the thing that's so important once you're sort of seeing what great actors can do, is there is so much an actor can do with a look that you don't need the 3 sentences for. By that same token, however, I do think scripts inherently are meant to be a little more overwritten in dialogue, just because you can't have. You don't have an actor to give you a look. You have to do it. I would say that, and as a general sense, the older I get, it's, if you have a scene, to me, it's like over a page and a half or 2 pages. It's like figure out how to cut it. Figure out how it's death to sort of. It's not to have someone sitting there and talking back and forth. So to me, it's say it out loud. Like imagine and just the less is often more.
Thank you, Rodney, and thank you, Ryan. Thank you so much for joining us and for your time, dropping your wisdom and all that, being awesome.
What if I don't leave the stage? It's going to ruin the whole thing.
If you just stay.
All right. Thank you, guys. It was great meeting you all.
Thank you.